You lost, buddy? First class is for paying pa. That was the first thing the flight manager said to him. No greeting, no professionalism, just pure arrogance. I was sitting just a few rows away, watching the whole thing unfold, and let me tell you, I have never seen someone get humbled so fast. The guy he was talking to? He didn't look rich, that's for sure. His jeans were old, his sneakers were worn out, and his jacket looked like something you'd wear to run errands, not board a luxury flight. No Rolex, no designer luggage, just a simple backpack slung over his shoulder. And that was enough for the flight manager to size him up and decide, this guy doesn't belong here. The man blinked, confused. This is first class, right? The manager folded his arms, smirking. Yeah, and your seat is probably. I could see passengers already watching, some whispering. A businessman in a tailored suit smirked. A woman in pearls raised an eyebrow at her husband. They were waiting for the guy to be embarrassed, to turn around and slink back to where he belonged. But instead, he calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out his ticket, and handed it. I think this is my seat. The manager barely glanced at it before. First class? You sure you can afford it? I swear, the air in that cabin changed. I saw it in the way the other passengers reacted. A few exchanged amused glances. Someone chuckled. It was that unspoken rule of high society. If you look like you don't belong, you don't belong. And yet, the man in the worn-out clothes just stood there. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the flight manager. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, just quiet patience, like he'd seen this 1,000 times before. Then, a woman's voice cut through the air. Excuse me, is there a problem? Heads turned. A young woman, a few rows back, was leaning forward in her seat, looking pissed. The flight manager turned to her, clearly irritated by the interruption. Not at all, ma'am. I was just making sure this gentleman wasn't lost. She let out a sharp laugh, short, almost disbelieving. Lost? She shook her head. Do you not know who this is? The manager frowned. Should I? The woman stared at him like he had just asked who the president was. That's Jackie Chan. Silence. The businessman in the suit sat up straighter. The woman in pearls suddenly looked very interested in her hands. And the flight manager? His whole face changed. You could see it. That split second of realization. The moment it all clicked. Jackie. Freaking Chan. The global icon, the martial arts legend, the man who had built his entire career from nothing, who had spent decades breaking bones, performing death-defying stunts, and becoming one of the most beloved actors in the world. And this guy had just asked him if he could afford a first-class ticket. I swear, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The flight manager opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to stutter out some excuse, but before he could say anything, Jackie just took back his ticket with a small, polite smile. I'll take my seat now, he said. No anger. No ego. No do you know who I am? Just pure class. And somehow that made it worse. Because Jackie Chan didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to throw his name around or demand respect. He already had it. And now? Now the entire first-class cabin was sitting in thick, uncomfortable silence while the flight manager practically ran in the other direction. A guy across the aisle leaned over to Jackie, still stunned. That was crazy, he whispered. Why didn't you just tell him who you were? Jackie smiled, looking out the window as if none of it had even fazed him. If respect has to be demanded, he said, then it's not real respect. And just like that, he closed his eyes, letting the lesson sink in. That day, a simple misunderstanding became a powerful moment, one that left an entire cabin reflecting on what it truly means to judge a person's worth. Thick in the air that even the people who weren't involved suddenly feel embarrassed? That's exactly what happened the moment that woman said his name. That's Jackie Chan. Boom. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The flight manager, who just seconds ago was standing there, chest puffed out, full of confidence, suddenly looked like he'd swallowed a rock. His face lost its color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The businessman who had been smirking earlier? Now he was sitting up straight, eyes wide. The woman in pearls, who had been whispering about how some people don't belong here, was suddenly staring at her hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone. And Jackie? Still sitting there. Still calm. Still watching. It was like he had known this moment was coming all along. But what happened next was what really made the whole plane fall into an awkward, stunned silence. The flight manager's desperate attempt to save face for a few seconds. The flight manager just stood there, blinking rapidly like he was trying to process what had just happened. You could see his brain scrambling, trying to find a way to dig himself out of this hole. Then, like a man clinging to his last shred of authority, he let out a nervous chuckle. "Ah, Mr. Chan. My apologies, sir. I didn't recognize you at first." Jackie tilted his head slightly, still watching him with that same unreadable expression. "Oh." His voice was light, casual. "You didn't recognize me?" The manager let out another awkward laugh, shifting his stance. "Yes, well, we have to ensure first class remains exclusive. You understand, of course." There it was. The pathetic attempt to justify himself. The businessman in the suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The passengers who had been laughing just a minute ago now looked uneasy, as if realizing they had played a part in this humiliation. Jackie leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "So, if you had recognized me earlier, would you have treated me differently?" The flight manager's face twitched. He had no good answer to that, because the truth was clear to everyone in that cabin. The lesson Jackie taught without saying a word. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Jackie did something that made the entire plane hold its breath. He smiled. Not an arrogant smile, not a gotcha smile, just a small, knowing one. And then, in the most effortless, calm motion, he reached down, grabbed his backpack, that same, simple, worn-out bag that had probably convinced the flight manager he was a nobody, and unzipped it. For the first time since the whole ordeal started, he spoke with intention. "I always wondered something," he said, his voice still light, but now carrying a weight that made the whole cabin lean in to listen. The flight manager swallowed hard. "Sir?" Jackie reached into his backpack and pulled out something small and golden. A custom, limited edition Jackie Chan gold coin. A collector's item given to him by a luxury airline years ago in honor of his contribution to the film industry and global travel. He turned it over in his fingers, letting the light catch on its surface. Then he looked up at the flight manager and asked, "Do you think this would have been enough proof that I belong in first class?" The flight manager's face turned an even deeper shade of red. Passengers exchanged glances. Someone coughed awkwardly. The energy had shifted so dramatically that it was almost suffocating. The message was clear. Jackie had never needed to prove his worth. But the fact that the flight manager only cared about his status after realizing who he was, that was the real problem. The ripple effect. The flight manager's lips parted like he was about to say something. But then Jackie did something else that shut him up completely. He put the gold coin back into his backpack, zipped it up, leaned back in his seat, and crossed his arms. "So," he said, tilting his head slightly, "should I stay? Or do you still think I don't belong here?" Nobody dared to breathe. The flight manager looked like he wanted to disappear. Finally, after a long, painful pause, he bowed his head slightly. "Of course, sir. Please enjoy your flight." Jackie gave him a small nod, then turned his attention back to the window, as if nothing had happened. The flight manager hurried away, disappearing behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. And just like that, the lesson had been delivered. The quiet apologies for the next few minutes. Nobody spoke. Then, one by one, the passengers who had been mocking Jackie earlier started shifting in their seats. The businessman who had laughed, he coughed, adjusted his tie, and avoided Jackie's gaze. The woman in pearls stole a glance at him, then quickly looked away. And then, something surprising happened. One of the passengers, a younger man in a navy blazer, stood up and walked over to Jackie's seat. "I just wanted to say," he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, "that was messed up. I judged you too, and I shouldn't have." Jackie turned to him, eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm really sorry, man," the young guy said, looking genuinely ashamed. Jackie looked at him for a moment, then smiled warmly. "No worries," he said, waving a hand. "We all make mistakes." The young man nodded, relieved, then hurried back to his seat. But the ripple effect had started. A few minutes later, the businessman leaned over. "For what it's worth," he muttered, "I feel pretty stupid right now." Jackie chuckled. "Don't be. Just remember this next time." And with that, the entire energy of the cabin shifted. People who had once looked at Jackie with amusement now looked at him with respect. The lesson had landed. The last words of wisdom, the plane had taken off, and the tension had finally settled. A man across the aisle, someone who had been watching quietly the entire time, leaned toward Jackie. "That was crazy," he whispered. "Why didn't you just tell him who you were?" Jackie smiled, turning his gaze back to the window. "If respect has to be demanded," he said softly, "then it's not real respect." And just like that, he ended the conversation. No need to gloat. No need for anger. No need to prove anything. He had already won. And the entire first-class cabin knew it. The flight had been in the air for an hour, but the first-class cabin was still drowning in an awkward silence. No one dared to speak about what had just happened. No one even dared to look at Jackie Chan for too long, as if making eye contact with him would remind them of their own mistakes. The businessman who had laughed earlier sat stiffly in his seat, scrolling through his phone, but his eyes weren't really moving. The woman in pearls, who had whispered about people who don't belong here, kept stealing glances at Jackie before quickly looking away, guilt clear on her face. Even the flight attendants seemed different, more hesitant, more aware of the tension that still lingered in the air. And the flight manager? Gone. Vanished behind the first-class curtain, probably hiding in the galley, wrestling with the weight of what had just happened. Jackie, on the other hand, he sat there like nothing had happened, relaxed, at peace, gazing out the window, completely unbothered. It was almost infuriating, because somehow, without raising his voice, without throwing a tantrum, without even demanding respect, he had taken complete control of the situation. But then, someone finally spoke. "Man, that was crazy." The voice came from a younger guy sitting across the aisle. He looked about 30, wearing a navy blazer, and had clearly been waiting for the right moment to say something. Jackie turned to him, raising an eyebrow slightly. The guy swallowed, like he wasn't sure if he should even be asking. "The way you handled that. I mean, that flight manager treated you like garbage. Why didn't you just, I don't know, tell him who you were?" Jackie just smiled. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at the younger man with an expression that was both kind and knowing. "Let me ask you something," he said. "If I had told him who I was, and then he changed his attitude, would that mean he respected me?" The man frowned slightly. "I mean, yeah?" Jackie shook his head, still smiling. "No, it means he respected my name, not me." The younger man blinked, thinking about it for a second, and then you could see it, the realization hitting him like a slow-moving train. If Jackie had shouted his name the second he was mistreated, would that have changed the flight manager's heart? Or would it have just changed his behavior? That was the problem. And Jackie had known it from the very beginning. That's why he never reacted. That's why he let it play out. Because respect that only appears after a name is revealed isn't respect at all. It's fear. But before the younger man could respond, something happened that made the entire cabin freeze. The curtain to the galley shifted, and the flight manager stepped back into the cabin. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the superiority that had been dripping from his voice just an hour ago. Now, he looked like a man who had been forced to stare into a mirror and really see himself for the first time. His hands clutched a small notepad, the kind flight staff used to take special requests from VIP passengers. But this time, it wasn't being used for business. It was being used for something much harder. An apology. He took a deep breath, then walked toward Jackie's seat. Every passenger in first class watched in silence, waiting, their eyes flicking back and forth between Jackie and the man who had humiliated him. When the flight manager finally stopped in front of Jackie, he cleared his throat, but his voice was noticeably softer now. "Mr. Chan," he said, forcing himself to hold eye contact, though it was clearly difficult. I wanted to apologize." Jackie just looked up at him, waiting. The flight manager swallowed hard. "I made a mistake. I judged you by your appearance, and I was wrong." There it was. The words everyone had been waiting for. But Jackie still said nothing. Not because he was being cruel. Not because he wanted to see the man suffer, but because he wanted to see if the flight manager really meant it. The silence stretched. The flight manager shifted uncomfortably, but didn't back down. He didn't try to excuse himself, didn't try to make a joke to ease the tension. And finally, Jackie nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. But somehow, that meant more than any grand forgiveness speech ever could. The flight manager bowed his head slightly, then stepped back, walking away without the arrogance he had before. For a few moments, the entire cabin was completely silent. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, half the cabin was clapping, not just for Jackie, but for the lesson they had just witnessed. A few people even nodded in his direction, their eyes filled with silent respect. Jackie, still relaxed in his seat, let out a small chuckle and shook his head. "You don't have to clap," he said playfully. "It's not a movie." That made the passengers laugh, and just like that, the tension that had been hanging in the air finally lifted. But the lesson remained, because everyone on that flight walked away different from how they had boarded. The businessman who had laughed at Jackie earlier, he had spent the rest of the flight deep in thought, clearly reflecting on his own behavior. The woman in pearls, who had whispered about people not belonging, never made eye contact again, but she clutched her purse a little tighter, as if realizing how ridiculous her own assumptions had been. And the young man who had asked Jackie why he didn't just reveal his name, he looked like he had learned something that no amount of money could have ever bought him. By the time the plane landed, everyone in first class had changed. Not because Jackie demanded it, not because he forced it, but because he let people reveal their own true colors, and they judged themselves. And that, more than anything, is why Jackie Chan isn't just a legend in the movies. He's a legend in real life.